So let's take a closer look at this REST and GraphQL thing. How do these APIs look like in detail? Well, as I mentioned, we still have that client-server combination, and the server uses Node-Express, and then we talk to a MongoDB database from that Node-Express server. The client, of course, uses React. Now, how does such a request look like, which we send to the Node-Express server if that server is built as a REST API? Well, as I mentioned, it's a combination of a specific URL, or specifically the path, which is the thing after the domain, because the domain, of course, will always be the same. Yourpage.com, for example, is the domain. But the thing thereafter, /products, /nothing, /new, /user, whatever it is, that is the path. And that combined with a specific HTTP verb triggers a specific action, at least if we support that path verb combination on the server. For example, we could be sending a post request with the post HTTP verb to the /post URL, or a get request to /posts, or a get request to /posts/ and then some dynamic path segment, which Node-Express also supports, so that we, for example, could have different IDs of posts which are parts of our incoming requests. These are our so-called API endpoints, and as I mentioned multiple times, it's up to us, the developer of the Node-Express REST API, to decide which endpoints we want to support, and then upon getting a request on such an endpoint, we run some server-side logic to do whatever we want to do, for example, to reach out to the database and then store data there, get data from there, and so on. Now, when it comes to these HTTP methods, post and get might be methods or verbs you already know, but there's more than just get and post. Of course, we have get, which we typically use to get data or get a resource from the server. And we have post to post data to a server, so to send data there and then create new data, a new object, new resources on the server. But we got more than that. We also got put, which we typically use to create or override a resource, patch, which we use to update an existing resource on a server, delete to delete a resource, and also actually options, which we won't send on ourselves, but which the browser automatically attaches for certain requests, which the browser then uses to find out if the request we actually want to send is supported. I will come back to that later. Now, what's really important to understand here, because it's a common misconception, is that just because you send a post request, you don't actually store something in a database automatically. As I mentioned, it's up to you, the developer of the API, to decide what you want to do, which code you want to execute, for which verb path combination. And you typically want to map the verbs in a way that's logical. So you want to create data when a post request is received. You want to delete data when a delete request is received. But theoretically, you could also return data, so you could get data upon a delete request, or return data upon a put request, or return data upon a post request. That would just not be logical, and therefore you want to avoid it. But it's really important to understand that the verb path combination alone does not dictate what happens on the server. That is up to the logic you wrote there for the different verb path combinations. So that's REST. Now, what about GraphQL? When we have a look at that same picture for GraphQL, we have the same general logic, and that's important to understand. We send a request to the Node-Express app then, but how does this look like now? As I mentioned, with GraphQL, there aren't multiple endpoints. There is one single endpoint, and that typically is a post request on some path of your choice. Often the path is /GraphQL, but that's not a must use. Now, the trick here is that this request, since it's a post request, has a request body. And that request body contains a query expression written in a standardized GraphQL query language, which is then parsed by your Node-Express server. And if you then wrote code to support that specific expression which was sent, you can then, use the data, which is part of that expression and so on, to store data or to get data and so on. The query, which could be in the post request body, typically looks something like this. We describe the operation we want to perform. Alternatives to query, which we typically use to get data, would be mutation to add or change data, or subscription to set up a live subscription. We then have an identifier of our choice, which we also could call endpoint therefore. And then the data we, for example, want to request or we want to send. Now, I do have a free series on how to build basically a simple MERN application with a GraphQL backend, and attached you find a link where you learn how to build such a GraphQL backend from scratch. So that might also be interesting for you if you want to learn more about GraphQL. In this course, when we compare REST to GraphQL, we will go with REST, and here's why. The REST API approach uses this path HTTP method combination to identify resources or actions on a server, and that's very intuitive and very easy to learn. Such an API is stateless and decoupled from any frontend, which means a REST API you build cannot just be used with your React single-page application. Any client could talk to it. So if you later build a mobile application with iOS or Android, you could talk to that same API because the API is totally separated from the frontend, which is the cool thing about this API approach. You can reuse the API and just attach different frontends. One of the reasons why such APIs are so popular these days. Now, we will use the REST API in this course because it's the most common type of API. You see a lot of APIs built in that way out there in the wild because it's easy to use, easy to learn, easy to document, and very intuitive in the end. Now, a GraphQL API does not use the path HTTP method as you learned, but instead such a query expression using a certain query language to identify a resource in action. And just like the REST API, it's also stateless and decoupled. So just as with the REST API, you can attach any client to that API, which is great. But the reason why we won't use it is that despite GraphQL being very popular and very useful and powerful, you need to learn that extra query language, which is some extra effort, which not everyone wants to do. In addition, out there in the wild, you see way more REST APIs than GraphQL APIs, so I find it more important to learn that. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, attached you find a link to a free series I created in the past, where we also built a GraphQL API, and actually also a Node.Express and React application that works with it, for free in a complete series. So this might be interesting to you if you want to learn more about that. In this course, we'll build a REST API from scratch because it is so important and so powerful, and we will build it from the ground up so that you definitely learn everything that's to it.